50 American soldiers vanished in a single night during the Tet Offensive. No gunfire, no distress calls, just silence where a village once stood. For 22 years, the Pentagon classified their disappearance as combat losses due to enemy action. But in 1990, a CIA operative broke his silence, revealing something far more disturbing than any battlefield casualty report could ever contain. If you want to hear more stories like this that the government doesn't want you to know about, hit that subscribe button right now. The morning mist hung thick over the Mekong Delta on January 29, 1968. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres adjusted his radio pack as Alpha Company's 2nd Platoon prepared for what command called a routine village security operation. Torres had been in country for 8 months, long enough to know that nothing in Vietnam was ever routine. The men around him, 50 fresh-faced soldiers, most barely 20 years old, carried the nervous energy of troops heading into unknown territory. Private Danny Martinez, just 19 and 3 weeks out of basic, approached Torres with obvious concern. Martinez whispered that something felt wrong about this mission. Torres told him to stay sharp and trust his instincts, but privately, the sergeant shared the boy's unease. The brass had been unusually secretive about their destination, and the maps they'd been given showed discrepancies that didn't match standard military cartography. Their mission briefing had been unusually brief. Secure the hamlet of Bin Hoa. Establish defensive positions. Wait for further orders. What struck Torres as odd was the presence of 3 civilians in their convoy, men in pressed khakis who introduced themselves only as advisors from Saigon. They carried no weapons, only metal briefcases and clipboards filled with forms that none of the soldiers were allowed to see. The lead advisor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who called himself Dr. Henley, spoke to Torres with a kind of condescending tone that immediately raised red flags. Henley explained that this was a new type of hearts and minds operation, designed to test innovative communication methods with local populations. When Torres asked for more details, Henley simply smiled and said that everything would become clear once they reached their destination. The village appeared ordinary at first glance. Thatched roofs, muddy paths, the familiar smell of cooking fires and livestock. But something felt wrong. The local children didn't run to greet them with outstretched hands begging for chocolate or cigarettes. Instead, they watched from doorways with vacant expressions, their dark eyes following the soldiers' movements with an unsettling intensity. Corporal Jimmy Lee, the platoon's radio operator, commented on how quiet the village seemed. There were no dogs barking, no chickens running around, no normal sounds of daily life. Even the children moved differently, as if they were sleepwalking through their daily routines. Torres positioned his men in a defensive perimeter around the village centre, while the 3 advisors disappeared into a larger building that served as the hamlet's meeting hall. Through the open doorway, he could see them setting up equipment, strange devices with wires and blinking lights that looked nothing like standard military communications gear. When Private Johnson asked what the civilians were doing, Torres just shook his head and told him to focus on his sector. But privately, Torres was keeping detailed notes in a small journal he carried, a habit that would later save his life and expose the truth about what happened that night. As the afternoon wore on, Torres noticed more disturbing details about the village. The adults moved with the same vacant expression as the children, performing routine tasks with mechanical precision. An elderly woman swept the same patch of ground repeatedly for over an hour. A man carried an empty water bucket back and forth between 2 wells without ever filling it. When Corporal Lee tried to engage some of the villagers in basic Vietnamese phrases he'd learned, they stared at him blankly and didn't respond. But the real strangeness began after sunset. The advisors emerged from the meeting hall, carrying small devices that looked like transistor radios. Dr. Henley approached Torres with a clipboard and a device, explaining that each soldier would receive one of these special communication units. Henley said they were testing a new frequency that would allow them to receive important weather and intelligence updates without interfering with standard military channels. Torres questioned the necessity of additional equipment when they already had functioning radios. Henley's response was chilling in its casual tone. He explained that this was part of a larger study on soldier performance under different communication conditions. Every man was required to keep his special radio tuned to frequency 12.7 and listen for broadcasts that would begin at 2200 hours. Any soldier who failed to comply would be removed from the operation immediately. The phrase "removed from the operation" sent a chill down Torres's spine, but he distributed the devices to his men as ordered. Private Martinez approached him again, asking if he trusted the civilians. Torres told him to follow orders but stay alert, a conversation he recorded in his journal, along with detailed descriptions of the strange equipment and the advisor's suspicious behavior. As darkness settled over the hamlet, the broadcasts began. At first, they seemed harmless enough. Reports about atmospheric conditions, temperature readings, humidity levels, delivered in a monotone voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. But there was something hypnotic about the broadcaster's cadence, a rhythmic quality that seemed designed to burrow into the listeners' minds and take root there. Torres found himself struggling to concentrate on anything else as the broadcasts continued. His thoughts became foggy and disconnected, and he had to physically shake his head to clear away the mental haze that seemed to be settling over his consciousness. Around him, he could see his men beginning to exhibit strange behaviors, some swaying slightly as they stood at their posts, others staring off into the distance with unfocused eyes. Around midnight, he noticed that several of his men had stopped responding to his whispered check-ins over their regular radio frequency. When he moved to investigate, he found them sitting motionless at their posts, staring blankly ahead while the strange weather reports continued to drone from their special devices. Their eyes were open, but they seemed to be looking at something that wasn't there. Private Martinez was among them, his young face slack and expressionless, as he listened to broadcasts that Torres could barely make out through the static. When Torres called his name and shook his shoulder, Martinez didn't respond at all. It was as if the boy's mind had simply disconnected from his body, leaving behind an empty shell that breathed and blinked, but showed no signs of consciousness or personality. That's when Torres made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life and ultimately expose one of the most horrifying experiments in American military history. But the most shocking discovery was still to come. Torres turned off his special radio and crept toward the meeting hall to confront the advisors. The decision to disable his device probably saved his sanity, if not his life. Through a crack in the bamboo wall, he could see the three men huddled around a larger version of the broadcasting equipment, speaking in low, urgent tones about dosage levels and response rates, as if they were discussing medical treatments rather than radio frequencies. Dr. Henley was reading from a thick file labeled with a code that Torres carefully copied into his journal. MK Ultra, Sub-Project 68, Mindbridge, Vietnam. The other two advisors were monitoring banks of equipment that displayed what looked like brainwave patterns, discussing the neural response rates of different subjects identified only by numbers that Torres realized corresponded to his soldiers' service numbers. One of the advisors, a younger man with a southern accent, expressed concern about the effectiveness of the audio delivery system. He suggested that they needed to increase the psychoactive compounds in the village water supply to achieve better penetration of the subject's psychological defenses. Dr. Henley dismissed this concern, stating that the current combination of subliminal audio programming and chemical enhancement was producing acceptable results within operational parameters. Torres listened in growing horror as the advisors discussed the next phase of their experiment. The soldiers weren't just test subjects. They were going to be eliminated to protect the security of the operation. The entire village had been selected because of its isolation from main population centers, and both the American troops and the Vietnamese villagers were considered expendable assets in what the documents would later refer to as Project Mindbridge. But there was something even more disturbing in their conversation. According to the advisors' discussion, this wasn't the first time they had conducted such experiments. They referenced previous operations by code names that suggested a widespread program of testing on American military personnel throughout Southeast Asia. Dr. Henley mentioned that they had refined their techniques through earlier trials on prisoners of war and entire units that had volunteered for what they believed were routine intelligence-gathering missions. The younger advisor asked about disposal protocols for the subjects once the experiment was complete. Dr. Henley's response was delivered with chilling matter-of-factness. Some subjects would be transported to facilities in Thailand and the Philippines for further testing, while others would simply be reported as combat casualties and buried in unmarked graves. The few who showed particular resistance to the mind control techniques would be kept for extended study. Torres tried to alert his platoon, but discovered that the mind control broadcasts had already taken hold of his men. When he whispered urgently to Corporal Lee about the need to evacuate immediately, Lee stared at him with empty eyes and asked if he had received the special orders that were being broadcast on the emergency frequency. Torres realized with growing panic that his soldiers were no longer capable of independent thought or action. His men moved like sleepwalkers, following commands that only they could hear through their special radios. Some began walking toward the jungle's edge in perfect formation, while others simply sat down where they stood and closed their eyes as if falling asleep on command. The village children, who had apparently been exposed to earlier versions of the same technology, moved in perfect synchronization to help the advisors load equipment into helicopters that had arrived without making any sound. In desperation, Torres grabbed his regular radio and attempted to contact base command, but instead of his company commander's voice, he heard only static punctuated by the same hypnotic broadcasts that had entranced his men. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This operation had approval from the highest levels of command. His platoon hadn't been sent to protect a village. They had been sent to disappear. Private Martinez approached him one final time, his movements mechanical and his voice completely devoid of emotion. Martinez said that he had received special orders to report to the landing zone for immediate extraction, and he wanted to know why Torres wasn't following the same commands. Torres watched in helpless horror as the boy he had tried to protect walked away into the darkness, joining the line of soldiers who were boarding the unmarked helicopters. The last thing Torres remembered clearly was the sound of rotor blades growing louder overhead. He had managed to hide in an abandoned well at the village's edge, clutching his service rifle and his journal while watching his fellow soldiers being loaded onto aircraft, along with the strange broadcasting equipment. The advisors moved efficiently, destroying evidence and planting explosive charges that would level the entire hamlet within hours. Dr. Henley supervised the operation with the same calm professionalism he had shown throughout the day. Torres watched him check items off a list as each piece of equipment was removed and each group of subjects was secured for transport. The advisor paused at one point to speak into a radio, reporting that Phase 1 of the operation had achieved full success and that they were proceeding to Phase 2 disposal protocols. When Torres finally emerged from his hiding place the next morning, Bin Hoa was gone. Not destroyed by enemy action, but erased, as if it had never existed at all. The jungle had already begun to reclaim the cleared spaces where buildings once stood, and all traces of the road that had led them there had been carefully obscured. Even his radio no longer received any signals from his unit's frequency, and when he tried to contact base command, he was told that no operation had been scheduled for his coordinates. But the real shock came when Torres made his way back to base camp 3 days later. According to official records, his entire platoon had been killed in action during a Viet Cong ambush at a location 50 miles from where they had actually been deployed. Torres was immediately debriefed by intelligence officers who seemed more interested in what he couldn't remember than what he could. When he showed them his journal with its detailed notes about the advisors and their equipment, he was told that stress and trauma often caused soldiers to create false memories as a coping mechanism. For 22 years, Torres kept his silence, believing that no one would accept his account of what had happened that night. The journal became his most precious possession, the only proof that his men had existed and that their sacrifice had meaning beyond the official lies. He was quietly transferred to a non-combat role before being medically discharged for psychological trauma that doctors attributed to combat stress rather than the horrifying truth he had witnessed. The medical reports from his discharge painted a picture of a soldier who had suffered a complete mental breakdown after losing his entire unit in combat. But Torres knew better. The same techniques that had been used on his men were being used to discredit his testimony and ensure that Project Mindbridge remained classified. Every time he tried to tell his story, he was dismissed as a traumatized veteran whose grip on reality had been shattered by the horrors of war. But in 1990, everything changed when a former CIA operative named David Kellerman came forward with documents that corroborated Torres's story in terrifying detail. Kellerman had worked as a psychological operations specialist for the agency throughout the 1960s and 1970s, participating in programs that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in the name of national security. His conscience finally got the better of him when he learned that many of the techniques developed in Vietnam were being adapted for use on American civilians in domestic intelligence operations. The documents that Kellerman smuggled out of Langley revealed that Project Mindbridge had been just one component of a massive psychological warfare program that treated American soldiers as expendable test subjects. The files contained detailed reports on dozens of similar experiments conducted throughout Southeast Asia, each one designed to refine techniques for creating perfectly obedient military units that could be programmed to carry out operations without question and then be made to forget everything they had witnessed. Kellerman's revelation included transcripts of conversations between the advisors that matched Torres's journal entries with frightening accuracy. Dr. Henley's real name was Dr. Marcus Webb, a psychiatrist who had worked on early MKUltra programs before being reassigned to overseas operations. His specialty was developing audio-based psychological manipulation techniques that could be deployed in field conditions without requiring extensive medical infrastructure. According to the classified reports, the technology used to control Torres's platoon had been tested on American prisoners of war who had been secretly transferred to black sites rather than returned through normal prisoner exchange programs. The techniques had proven so effective that the agency had begun using entire military units as unwitting test subjects, selecting units that were scheduled for high-risk operations where casualties would be expected and wouldn't raise suspicions. But there was something even more disturbing in Kellerman's files. The fate of Torres's platoon remained classified under national security protocols, but the documents suggested that many of the soldiers had survived the initial experiment. Some had been transported to facilities in Thailand and the Philippines for further experimentation with advanced forms of psychological conditioning. Others had been kept at domestic facilities where they became permanent test subjects for increasingly sophisticated forms of mind control. The most chilling revelation was that several soldiers from Torres's platoon had eventually been released back into American society after undergoing extensive memory modification procedures. These men returned to their families with no recollection of their time in Vietnam, beyond what had been implanted as false memories. They lived normal lives, raised families, and never suspected that they had been victims of their own government's psychological experiments. Kellerman's documents included photographs of some of these men taken years after their supposed deaths in Vietnam. They showed middle-aged men living under assumed identities in suburban communities across America, their minds carefully programmed to activate sleeper protocols if certain trigger phrases were broadcast on specific frequencies. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through the intelligence community and led to a massive cover-up operation that continues to this day. Torres himself had only survived because he had turned off his radio at the crucial moment, breaking the hold that the broadcasts had established over his mind. But even he couldn't be certain how much of his memory remained intact. or whether his own account of that night had been altered by exposure to the early stages of the mind control process. His journal became not just evidence of what had happened, but proof that his own memories could be trusted. When Kellerman's story broke in 1990, the Pentagon issued a standard denial, dismissing his claims as the fantasies of a disgruntled former employee who had been terminated for psychological instability. But investigative journalists who attempted to verify the locations mentioned in his documents found something unsettling. Satellite imagery from the 1960s showed clear evidence of settlements in areas that current maps listed as uninhabited jungle. Ground surveys of these locations revealed foundations and metal debris consistent with structures that had been systematically demolished and then concealed under layers of jungle growth. Chemical analysis of soil samples found traces of compounds that matched the psychoactive substances mentioned in Kellerman's documents, providing physical evidence that the experiments had actually taken place. The most compelling evidence came from Torres's journal itself. Handwriting analysis confirmed that the entries had been written contemporaneously with the events they described, and the technical details about the broadcasting equipment matched classified specifications for devices that wouldn't be acknowledged to exist until decades later. The journal became a crucial piece of evidence that corroborated Kellerman's claims and forced the government to admit that at least some aspects of Project Mindbridge had been real. But the real shock came when other veterans began coming forward with similar stories. Torres, now in his 70s, has connected with families of soldiers who disappeared under mysterious circumstances throughout the Vietnam War. Their research has uncovered patterns that suggest Project Mindbridge may have been far more extensive than even Kellerman realized. Dozens of units reported missing in action show the same characteristics: remote locations, minimal enemy contact, and circumstances that don't match standard combat scenarios. The families of these missing soldiers have formed a network that shares information and supports each other in their search for answers. They've discovered that many of the locations where units disappeared have been systematically excluded from official war histories and military maps. Satellite imagery from the period shows evidence of American military activity in areas that the Pentagon claims were never occupied by U.S. forces. Most disturbing of all, some family members have reported being contacted by men claiming to be their supposedly dead relatives. These contacts always follow the same pattern: brief phone calls or letters that reference personal information that only the missing soldiers would know, followed by warnings not to investigate their disappearances any further. The messages suggest that some of the Project Mindbridge subjects may still be alive, living under government control and occasionally allowed to reach out to their families as a form of psychological torture. The technology that disappeared 50 soldiers in a single night didn't vanish with the end of the Vietnam War. According to documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests filed by Torres and his network of families, research into audio-based psychological manipulation continued for decades after the conflict ended. Some experts believe that the techniques developed in programs like Project Mindbridge have evolved into more sophisticated forms of influence that are still being tested and refined today. Modern neuroscience has revealed that the human brain is far more susceptible to audio manipulation than scientists understood in the 1960s. Specific frequencies and rhythmic patterns can induce altered states of consciousness that make subjects highly susceptible to suggestion and programming. The technology that was crude and experimental 50 years ago has likely been refined to the point where it could be deployed on a massive scale without detection. The implications reach far beyond a single lost platoon in the Mekong Delta. If an entire unit of American soldiers could be made to disappear without leaving any trace in official records, what other gaps exist in our understanding of military history? How many other operations have been erased from the historical record to protect classified research programs that continue to operate in the shadows of national security? Torres asks this question every day as he continues his search for his missing men. His journal, now preserved in a secure location with copies held by multiple news organizations, stands as testament to the courage of soldiers who were betrayed by the very system they had sworn to serve. But it also serves as a warning about the ongoing threat posed by government agencies that view American citizens as acceptable casualties in their pursuit of psychological warfare capabilities. Perhaps most troubling of all is the question that keeps Torres awake at night. If 50 men could vanish without anyone noticing for 22 years, how many other shadows are still moving through the margins of documented history, carrying secrets that someone decided the world should never know? The hamlet of Bin Hoa remains absent from all official maps of Vietnam. Satellite images of the area show only unbroken jungle canopy, as if human habitation had never touched that particular patch of earth. But locals in the region still speak in whispers of American ghosts that wander the forest at night, following radio signals that only they can hear, forever searching for a way home from a mission that officially never began. The truth about Project Mindbridge may never be fully revealed, but Torres's journal ensures that the sacrifice of his men will not be forgotten. Their story serves as a reminder that the greatest enemy of freedom is often found not on foreign battlefields, but in the secret facilities where unelected officials decide which truths the public is allowed to know. If this story disturbs you as much as it should, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The only way to honor these forgotten soldiers is to make sure their story doesn't disappear into the same darkness that claimed their lives. Subscribe for more classified stories that the government doesn't want you to know. And remember, the truth is always more terrifying than fiction.